This is a representative of the Living Legend Library endorsed by the Oklahoma Historical Society and stored for public contact at the Oklahoma Christian College, Eastern and Memorial Road, Oklahoma City, where any interested person, the communications media, newspapers, radio and television, are welcomed for the purpose of hearing recorded history of the territories and state of Oklahoma. We are turning back the pages of time today, far into the 19th century, through a recorded interview with Mr. Orlando Walkling, who was a century of age the January past, and came to the Cherokee Strip or for the run for homes, riding horseback. A few days later, he returned to the land office and attempted to file for a claim. He has returned here to Perry for a visit with friends and relatives and will attend the Cherokee Strip opening celebration here tomorrow. The interviewers will be Mr. John Devine, Secretary and Manager of the Perry Chamber of Commerce, and Mr. George Hall, Executive Vice President of the Exchange Bank of Perry, where the interview is being held in the director's room. First, we will turn our interview over to Mr. Devine for his opening questions to Mr. Walkling.
Mr. Walkling, were you in the Indian Territory before the opening of the Cherokee Strip? Were you located in Indian Territory?
The first I remember was somewhere between where McAllister and Oklahoma City is, on the south side of the South Canadian River, is the first place that I can remember of knowing the locality.
Whom did you live with there?
When did you live?
Whom did you live with?
I worked with a surveying outfit, and the people that the cook and her husband, his name was Westbrook.
Where did you come from to Oklahoma?
I think I was born there, where I have just spoken.
Can you tell us something about your family, your parents and brothers or sisters?
I had 3 sisters, 2 older than myself and 1 younger, and my mother was Shawnee Indian woman. My father was an Englishman, and that's all I know.
How old were you when you first began traveling across Oklahoma?
Tell us that. Say that same thing again.
I was approximately 8 years old when I made a long trip across the territory on horseback with my mother and 2 sisters on horseback. My mother tied her knees together with a rag and put them astraddle of the pony's neck and carried my sister on her lap, and I rode a separate pony. I think we were nearly a year on the trip from somewhere near Topeka, Kansas to close to San Antonio, a little town named Boerne. I think it was in Kendall County, Texas, and I stayed there 1 year. And my brother-in-law, who owned the ranch, sold it. And for the next 6 or 8 years, I worked for different families on farms and dairies for my board and clothes.
What were you doing in Kansas before the opening of the Cherokee Strip?
I was working on the E.W. Barker's ranch in Coffee County, Kansas. It was the biggest cattle feeding ranch at that time that I knew of. I worked there nearly 5 years and left that to come to the opening of the Cherokee Strip.
How did you get information about the opening of the Cherokee Strip?
Grover Cleveland was president, and part of Oklahoma had been opened nearly 5 years before that, and the people all thought that it was desert, and the Indians was hostile, and there wasn't very many wanted to go to it when it was open for white settlement. But the few that did had wonderfully good crops and lots of grass and game, and the word got out all over the United States that it was a pretty good place. Well, then when President Cleveland issued the proclamation to open that Cherokee Strip, it was a strip of land 57 miles wide, north and south, and the south edge of it was 226 miles long. That was left for the Indians to go back and forth across hunting to the mountains. And the Indians was educated now, and the buffalo were all gone, and the land was just open. But cattlemen could go in there and pasture their cattle free, and there was a good many of them. So Governor Cleveland made them all vacate or move their herds, and agreed to let any man, 21, or the head of a family or a woman, could file on 160 acres. It had been surveyed 25 years before that, and the grass and the weather and the clumping of cattle and all had nearly eliminated all of the marks for the sections, cornerstones and such as that. And at the time it opened, there was so many there, and probably a dozen would run on 1/4 section on 160 acres. And each one would say he was there first and tell the others to get off. And there wasn't any law. Practically all of them carried guns, and the men that were the best shots and the biggest bluffers got the best of the land.
When you came to the edge of Kansas, how many days were you waiting before the opening of the Cherokee Strip?
Well, when I left that ranch and came south with 2 other men that had been working on the ranch, I had 3 horses and a wagon. Well, they just had a horse apiece, but we all boarded and and camped at nights along the road, and we got down there probably a month before the opening, before the 16th. Well, I and 2 other fellows dug a deep ditch in a bed of a creek along the road, and one end deeper, and we got water down there. Well, I would get down there and dip some water up and hand it to the fellow higher up in this ditch. Then he would hand it to another guy, and we'd water horses. Water was scarce, and lots of traffic on that road. Well, we would water horses, and you get 10 cents apiece for it, and made a little money there. Well, then a certain day we thought we could run into the strip at Arkansas City, right south of Arkansas City, Kansas. But we found out we would have to register at a booth. I didn't at that time know much of anything about it. but we was supposed to stand in line there till we could get up to some tents with ropes stretched around them and officers in the tent with desks. And they would let 10 in at a time and ask them their age and if they'd ever filed on any land before, and a few questions about where they come from and so on. Well, if you answered the questions right, they gave you a certificate, and then you were supposed to have that certificate if you got a claim and take that certificate with you to the land office to file on the claim. That's where I got the certificate. Tell you something that was funny.
Mr. Walken, could you describe something about the people who lined up on the line the day that they were to start the race, and how they started everybody to make this run?
The line of this trip, as they called it, was about 66 feet south of the Kansas line. There's supposed to be a road or a section line along the south edge of Kansas, and 66 feet from that line was the edge of this territory. And there was a soldier supposed to be about every half a mile or less along the line, and he was to shoot a gun at 12 o'clock, and we were all nervous and anxious and waiting to hear that shot. Well, I was there along the line with my horse's feet at the line, and they were so thick. I was there before daylight that morning and supposed to keep my place. Well, there were so many there that they all couldn't get against the line. Some of them were 3 miles from the line in the section lines coming out of Kansas with wagons and families and how to describe it, but they were so close together or backed up against the fence on each side of the road for 3 miles that you couldn't get closer. But I had been there for several weeks. Now I got right up to the line. I had a pretty good horse that I had brought down there, and then the team that I drove belonged to me. Well, at daylight that morning I was on the line, and that was one of the longest forenoons that I ever remember, waiting for that 12 o'clock. And when the gun shot, why, I run in there one of the first. They couldn't have been many ahead of me. Well, I rode for several miles on a big sorrel horse with a white face and the shafts and wheels of a buggy came and run along the side of my horse and run for several miles. Well, then another thing that I remember was a fellow had 2 wash pans, tin wash pans soldered together for a canteen. And he had a strap around his shoulder and that canteen behind him, and his horse was running and he was scared and he couldn't stop it. Well, that canteen was bouncing about 2 feet and hitting him in the back every jump that the horse took.
How many miles did you ride before you finally located what you thought might be a claim for you?
I don't know how many miles, but I would guess about 7 or 8 to a little creek. The water wasn't good to drink, but was clear, And I heard later they called it Bitter Creek, and the land was level there, and I thought I'd like to have a claim there. Well, I got off the horse, and I took a stake with me and stuck it in the ground not far from that creek. Well, I could see at least a dozen other men from there, some of them close together, had driven sticks in and standing there by their horses. And none of us knew the numbers of the land or where the lines or the corners of it was. And in that case, there might be a dozen of us on the same place. And none of us knew the number of the land. And if you wanted to file on a claim, you'd have to tell them the numbers of it. And we couldn't until we found out the numbers. Well, I stayed there that night, and the wagons and horsebackers are passing all the time where I had stopped. And there was lots of families in a wagon, and the man had rode ahead and left the wife and kids in a wagon to follow. Well, they got separated, and it couldn't find each other. And I remember the next morning and that night of hearing a man hollering. He had a good voice, and he'd yelling, "Oh, Paul, here's Ma," or "Joe, here's your mule, come and get it," or something like that. They got scattered and divided, and none of them knew the numbers to file on. And there might be a dozen or more on one quarter section. They claimed, I doubt if it's all true, but they claimed there were 20 men run in there after every quarter section. And those that landed on claims, when they did find the numbers, they probably was more than that. And they had to go to a land office to file on the land. And another thing, the man, if he had never been there, if he had knew the numbers and got to the land office and filed on certain numbers where you were, why, you would have to file a contest on him. And it made an awful mess.
Then did you come on to Perry and file for that claim? Or did you give up and let someone else have it?
No, I worked with another old man to find the numbers of the land. We found a township corner stone. That was a stone supposed to have been set there 25 years ago. And the township cornerstones had 6 marks across on each side. It was a little groove had been cut across them, and by that you would know there was another cornerstone 6 miles from that one in each direction. Each one would have those 6 marks, and it meant 6 miles away. And between them, the section number 1 of the township was numbered 1, and the next one west 2, clear on to the other corner. Well, that was 6. Well, then right south of section 6 was 7, and back east again to 12. They were numbered in that direction. And when they found out those numbers of that, I don't remember just how I got the right numbers of the land that I wanted to file on. Well, then I hurried to Perry, rode that horse to Perry. I saw by a map, a little one, big as a calling card, the numbers in a town supposed to be Perry. Well, I wanted to get to that to file. The land office was there. Well, when I got within about 12 miles of Perry, I could see a cloud of dust. And as I got closer, I could see white things. Well, they were tents and covered wagons, and the dust was so thick It hadn't rained to speak of since May, and that was September, and a tremendous amount of traffic. Lots of the horses shod to stir up the dust, and you can imagine what Perry looked like when I got there.
How long did you have to stand in line to file for your claim?
When I arrived at Perry, I don't know for sure, but I believe there was 75,000 people here ahead of me at the land office. You couldn't find a place to stop your wagon, and the railroad running north and south through there was stacked as high as the telephone wires on both sides of the track with merchandise of every description. I think there was 400 saloon stocks and fixtures shipped into Perry, and nearly as many lumber companies. And there was no side tracks. The side tracks were a couple of miles south of Perry, and not many of them. Well, all right. At the land office was a crowd of men, horseback and all, so thick for 100 yards around it that you couldn't get to it. And when they did, they would only let 10 in at a time. And they asked me a few questions. Well, I couldn't get in there for months before my turn come. I couldn't get a chance to file for months. There were so many ahead of me. They started a little newspaper in Perry. I think they printed it in Guthrie, and they printed the numbers of the claims that were filed on each day. Well, it would be a year or something like it before my turn would come. Well, I started to hauling stuff from the section house south of Perry for people that had cars shipped in there that they wanted to build buildings or live on the town site. Well, I worked at that for a few days, and then I got a job hauling rock to build one of the first buildings in Perry. That was Tom Willison's dad. I worked around there for 6 months, sleeping in my wagon or under it all the time, and part of the time I stood at the line to the post office to get mail. I wasn't really expecting mail, but there was many hundred of people that did, and it was the line to the window would wrap around the block, sometimes twice, and you'd have to stand in the line all day or longer to get to the window. Well, there were lots of people that had a little money and wasn't able to stand in that line, and they would want to buy somebody's place in the line if you would get up close to the window. Well, I sold my place in that line about 3 times for $10 when I had got close enough to the window so I could have got there in a short time. Well, then I went back to the end of the line and stayed there again until I got up close to the window. And in a few days, I had more money than I had when I left the ranch that I had been working on before I started.
When you finally got up to the land office to file for a claim, could you tell us something about that and where your claim really was?
Well, when I finally got to a turn to file, or before I did, I got to talking to an old man. His name was March, Old Man March, and he had came into the strip from the south, and he couldn't file on a claim himself. He had already used his head right, but he had a daughter, and she wanted him to get a claim for her, and that was he didn't want it himself. And when she found out where it was and what it was, she didn't want it. Well, this old man offered to trade me his right to it for one of my horses, the same horse that I rode in there. Well, I took him up, and he said he would take me out and show it to me the next morning. Well, he told me to be at his camp real early, and we'd go out there. Well, he told me where his camp was. It was on, this is Cow Creek, a little creek right here at the edge of Perry. And that morning I got up a good deal before daylight and tried to find his camp. I woke up 4 or 5 different people that were asleep in wagons and a tent or two before I found him. And he got up and he had a little bit of a pair of mules and a buckboard. Well, he said he would take me out and show me the place. And my turn to file was coming that night, on the next morning. Well, we started out there, and we had to go at least 2 miles in the wrong direction to get across that creek, and came around then nearly straight east of Perry, and went out somewhere near F Street is, and turned off south after we'd been 4 or 5 miles, and came to another little creek. And we couldn't get across. I couldn't get the team down the bank for the trees. Well, we finally found a place to get across, and then the old man was lost. He didn't know right where the place was. Well, we finally came to 2 little blackjack trees right on the corner of a hill. He drove his team up there, and we stopped and looked around. And then he recognized something and took me down to some timber on the north of those trees. And he found a tree there that the bark had been peeled off on one side a little, and a .45 shell had been driven in there with a hammer and the head sticking out. And he said, "This is it." Well, I told him all right, I'd give him the horse for it. Well, he took me back to Perry. Well, I filed the next morning. I had another team and a wagon. Well, I bought an axe and a bale of hay and a jug of molasses and started back out there. And I thought I could go a shorter route than the old man had taken me. And I did. But that night I came to that same creek. They called it Mule Creek. Well, I drove up a little on the bank, and I found a place that I could cross if I cut some trees on both sides. Well, it was a kind of a natural fall. The water fell off of a rock about 12 feet, and above that was solid rock, and I crossed on it and got up on the other side, and it was getting dark. Well, I camped there that night, and the next morning I left the team there and walked, I think, 5 or 6 miles, probably in different directions. But I finally came to those 2 little blackjack trees and seen this old man's mule tracks there. Well, then I knew the direction, and I came to that tree. Well, there was a big tree close there with a limb stretching out. I went back and got my wagon, and I drove some little forks in the ground under that tree and laid my wagon sideboards on those stakes, on those little forks, and stretched my wagon seat over those over that limb of the tree right over my sideboards. Well, that was my home for a year at least. I had traded a halter that I took off of a horse that a man had rode to death in that run, and the horse had a good halter on it. I took that off, and the day or so before I started, I traded that horse for a dog, and I had that dog with me. Well, that first night that I stayed there, the dog treed a possum under a rock right close where I lived, where I had my home.
What was the legal numbers of this claim, Mr. Walkling?
The numbers of this claim I got was the southeast quarter of Section 23, Township 21, Range 1 east of the Indian Meridian.
After you had stayed there, then what did you do for a living?
I commenced chopping wood and making fence posts, as the claim was practically all timber, and wood for fuel was scarce. In Prairie there was no coal there, or no gas, or was scarce. In Prairie there was no coal there, or no gas, or electricity. Well, wood was quite a demand for fuel, and west of Prairie for many miles there wasn't much timber, and fence posts were in demand. Well, I commenced to clearing a little land and selling the wood and fence posts.
You might remember a lot about how Perry grew, how it changed from all of those tents and the land office, and how it prospered. Could you tell us a little bit about what you remember of that side of life?
Well, I remember. I got a job several times in Perry, other than hauling wood. I got a job from an old German. I think he was a German. His name was Willison, and he was going to build a building on the north side of the square. And as I had a good team, he hired me to plow and scrape the dirt out from under to level it. And they dug a deep ditch on each side, and they called it the footing. He wanted a lot of big rock hauled and put in that. They called it the footing. And I worked for several days for old man Willison, building the building on the north side of the square, and I think it was the first permanent building in Perry.
Did you then start farming, and what did you grow?
As soon as I got the brush and timber off of the land, I plowed it and started to set out trees. And between the trees, I planted cotton. And one year I planted castor beans. And I've finally got 110 acres of it planted to peach trees.
Was this a prosperous adventure?
Well, I
harvest the peaches, and what did you do with them?
As far as being a prosperous investment, I hardly know what to say. Although I raised a great deal of fruit of the best quality, but the labor and the price I got when the season was over, if I had a few dollars left, I felt proud.
What did you do with the peaches?
Well, commission men would come there and look at my orchard and write letters. Some days I would get my mailbox full of letters from commission men all over the country that wanted to buy my peaches by the carload to ship to Chicago and New York and I don't know where all. Well, several years I had wonderful crops in the peach business. I had 6 rows of peaches nearly a mile long. They were on both sides of a section line, half a mile each, and there wasn't a missing tree in those 6 rows. And one year, as near as I could guess, and the commission man, they averaged 15 bushels to a tree. They were excellent quality. And I paid 18 cents a basket and a bushel baskets and delivered them to the car for 50 cents a bushel.
Didn't you operate a cannery at one time?
Yes, sir, I did. I called it a cannery then, but since I have been in California and seen the canneries out there, I'm ashamed to call it a cannery. Although I bought a big furniture car stacked full of 3-pound tin cans and hauled them home in a hay rack. It took several days. I put them over in the loft over a building that I had built for that purpose. And a hole to drop the cans through where they received 3 ounces of sugar before they hit the table. And I had at one time nearly 100 girls to peel the peaches, to peel them off by hand. I had a tent 20 by 40 and a porch nearly 90 feet long full of beds for those girls. And one Sunday, I canned 10,000 of those cans, 10,071. And I rented a building in Perry here and stored a great lot of them. I bought I don't think a carload, but a great lot of paper boxes from the Jayhawk Paper Company. I had to fold them together. They came flat, you know. Well, I rented the building here to store them in. I had labels, and they were nice. And later I shipped 2 carloads of the canned peaches to Drumright when they were starting the oil field over there, and hauled a 4-horse load over there. Now, I don't think you could go within 10 miles of 3 towns there. That's Drumright and Cushing and Oilton. But what you could see, tin cans scattered around every shack, and the label said Walkling's Can Factory. Well, I had quite a reputation here. People came as far as Wichita to buy my canned peaches to haul back by the wagon load. I sold them for $2.40 a case. That was 24 cans, 10 cents a piece. And when I was through, I was broke.
Did you drive horses or mules, or didn't you work oxen a lot?
In my young days, my mother and my brother-in-law had a ranch in Texas, and they were trying to break a lot of the land for agriculture. Well, they worked oxen. They had one big steer, big one, and he had snagged himself in the neck. I don't know, on a stub, or else he had been shot through the neck and left a hole. Well, when he would drink water, the water would squirt out of that hole. And there was always a wet place on his neck down there. Well, one thing that I can remember well was getting on my knees between his legs and holding my hand over that hole while he would drink. Well, during that time, I liked the oxen, and I got along good with them, and they would mind me, and I could work them by myself. I could catch them and yoke them up and work them myself. Well, after I got this claim, I thought it would be handy and nice if I could get some oxen. And I bought, before I was through, I had bought 12 of the biggest bulls that I could find. They were all bulls. And I broke them to work. And a lot of that orchard ground I had plowed with those bulls. And some stumps as big as 8 or 10 inches I could turn out with the plow. And I averaged all over that orchard. I think I had plowed it at least 10 inches deep. And I also hauled lots of wood and piling for bridges and any heavy loads that I needed. I worked those oxen. I hauled cotton to Prairie with them and wood, no telling what all. No one deep storm we had, the snow was 3 feet deep in the low places. And I started to town with a big load of wood. Fuel was scarce and people were phoning out there to me to bring them wood if I could. Well, I took a scoop shovel and started to town with about a cord of 4-foot wood, and on the road I met Dr. Bringle. He was in a carriage with a driver to drive the team, and he was bundled up with robes, and I was wading in the snow nearly waist deep right when I met him, and he stopped and hollered at me that him and I were the only men out in Noble County. Well, all the rest of the day, I never saw any tracks except in him and mine.
When you left the farm, did you come to Perry, and what business did you go into then, Mr. Walkley?
I had some children that I wanted to send to school. They had gone through the country school and was ready for higher grades. So my wife wouldn't let them stay in town unless she did. And it was too far for us to drive, for them to ride or drive back and forth. And so I decided to move to town. And I first rented a lot right on the corner of the south side of the square there. And I made a building like a cook shack or like a trailer and hauled it in there with my oxen. I parked it right next to the curb on the sidewalk. And I had dressed a good-sized beef that night and had with me. And I hired a lady meat cutter. Her name was Wills, Vandy Wills. She was going to cut the meat for me and hand it out of a small hole in the side of this shack. Well, I pulled up to that curb and had hardly stopped till a man came up and wanted to know about it, and if I sold it, and I told him yes. Well, he bought a whole quarter of it, and before night I had sold the tail and the soup bone and the last bit of it. I had this Vandy Wills to go around the square to several other markets and inquire the price that they sold different cuts for. And what they sold for 30 cents a pound, I sold for 15. And I sold lots of it for 2 for a quarter. And that I cleaned that beef up right away. I went home and she went with me, Vandy Wills. And we butchered 2 that Sunday. 2 good-sized beef and took them Monday. And I sold it. There was a hide man that came here once a month to buy the hides from all of us butchers. Well, that month when he come, I had 63 hides. And another prominent butcher here in town had 3. And I along fairly well with the meat till it commenced to get cold. The weather commenced to get cold. Well, there was a fellow here who wanted to sell me a building just north of the east side of the square, behind the pool hall. And I moved my market up there. They had been an oculist up there that fixed glasses and sold spectacles. And he had the downstairs and the upstairs partitioned off in little rooms. It was very cheaply done. Part of it was just pasteboard. And he would rent those rooms for people to stay all night. Well, he gave that up, and I moved my meat market up there because the weather got kind of bad. And I run the meat market there for 20 years.
That's where you were when I first knew you, Mr. Walkling. You may not remember it, but I remember when you were there. And I remember a big dog that you had, a big German police dog. Would you like to tell us something about him?
Well, when I got more cattle or hogs than I wanted to butcher, after I had killed and disposed of all the cattle that I started with, I probably had 500 head of my own when I started this business. And later I had to buy beef and cattle. And when I could get more than I wanted to butcher, I would haul them to Oklahoma City. And on my road right out of Oklahoma City to the packing town was a dog pond. And when I passed that, I seen a big pup, a big police pup, playing around there with a woman. And I had, before that, I had seen pictures of picture shows of a dog they called Rin Tin Tin. Well, I thought that dog looked like the pictures that I had seen, and I tried to buy it from the woman. She said it belonged to a man that had came from California and got sick and left the dog there for them to take care of until he got better. Well, the next trip I made down there, I still seen the dog. And I stopped and talked to the woman, and she sold it to me. I was so anxious to get it from its looks, according to those pictures I'd seen, that I gave her $20 for him. And on that, I brought that dog home with me and later kept him for 14 years. And there was a good many chances I had to sell him. I think he was one of the best trained dogs that I have ever had anything to do with. I could give him 2 orders at once. That is, I could tell him to take something somewhere and bring me something else back. Or he could go with me in a delivery wagon when I would deliver meat. And if I had forgotten anything, or the lady wanted any other small article, she could tell me. And I'd tell the dog, now you've got to come back here pretty soon and go on around the route maybe for an hour and come back to the shop and give the dog a package or a paper sack of whatever this woman wanted and tell him to take it right now. Well, in a few minutes, the phone would ring, and the woman says he's here with it, okay. Well, I was proud of that dog, and I wouldn't have taken hardly any amount of money with him, and they kept him for 14 years. I could often send him to the bank or to the post office with letters. I sent him to the bank many times, and he wouldn't leave until the clerk gave him the receipt to bring back. He would take my hammer or fence tools. I would fix fence in my pasture, sometimes a half a mile from my fence, from my wagon. Well, at one time I lost a pair of heavy pliers. They weren't regular pliers. They were made of purpose to pull staples and drive steeples for fencing. They weighed about at least a pound. Well, I lost them. I had forgotten where I had left them, and I needed them real bad. And I said to this dog, "Go get my pliers, Flat." Well, he lit out south across my pasture. In a few minutes he came back with them. They were rusty, and it had rained several times, and they'd been gone for practically a month. He had a better memory than I did about some things, and he knew the colors. I could tell him to pick paper out of the park and put it in the red barrel or the blue barrel or either color. He knew the colors. There's no mistake but what a dog can tell the colors as well as a human.
Mr. Walkley, I certainly do thank you for a lot of this information, and I may be back later, but right now Mr. Hall would like to ask you a question or two. Mr. George Hall.
Mr. Walkley, if we can, let's go back to the time of the actual run, the Cherokee Strip run in September 16th, 1893. And immediately after that, here in Perry, I think you've already mentioned the extremely dry conditions at that time. What did all of these thousands of people do for water supply?
Immediately after this strip opened, it hadn't rained for a long time, and there was a tremendous amount of traffic everywhere around Perry. The dust was deep, and it was hot, and it hadn't rained, some of them said, since May. But I think that's a mistake. I think it had rained a little since May, but that was September. And you see there was lots of dry, and the dust was thick. Everybody was dirty. There wasn't any laundry. There wasn't any drink. There was 2 or 3 wells that the government had drilled on the Perry Town site, but all of them but one that I know anything about was salt water, and you couldn't hardly drink it at all. And there was people who had got claims within several miles of Perry on some creek or had found a spring, and it was good business to haul that water to town in barrels if you could and sell it. And they established regular routes, go every day with 3 or 4 barrels of water on a wagon and a bucket or a quart, and furnish certain places that had it engaged. Well, for the first year or more, lots of people just depended on those watermen. They'd have their, like a milkman, they would agree to bring them so much water a day or so much every other day. And the laundries wasn't any laundry for a long time until a man named Martin was the first, had the first launderer. Even would go into a saloon and see a fellow with a dirty shirt on and tell him I'll wash it for a quarter or something of that kind. And I myself made a trade with an old colored woman, and she waded in the creek a little south of the C Street Bridge in Perry now, up to her knees, and would wash the clothes without ironing them or without soap or what do you call them, detergents? She'd do a better job of it than you would think. I had her wash some clothes for myself, but the fact is I didn't wear many. I just wore overalls and a jumper for winter and summer for several years there.
Thank you, Mr. Walker, and thank you, George. Sorry you have to go. Mr. Walker, do you remember a small town just south of Perry by the name of Horton, right on the Santa Fe Railroad?
I do, but it wasn't a real town.
What was it?
It was a section house and a water tank, and there was a dam across the creek there to hold the water back, just a purpose for the railroad engines. There was a little cafe and several little enterprises started up there right after the opening, and they thought maybe they could make a town out of it in place of Perry, but it failed.
What finally happened to it? Do you remember?
For a long time, a couple of years at least, the train just stopped there. It didn't stop at Perry. They had a makeshift depot down there, and the railroad was blockaded. There was so much stuff wanted to be shipped in here, and they would sidetrack the cars and keep them some freight that people were looking for would be a month of getting here. And there was a lot of traffic up and down the railroad to see if their goods had come. I have saw as much traffic on the railroad south of Perry to the depot as I ever have seen in the streets of a big city. Going down there, and the depot agent and his help were so busy, you would ask them a question and they couldn't look up at you. There were so many expecting a carload of furniture or a carload of something that might have been sidetracked for a month before it would get there. And the help that they had down there couldn't handle it.
Mr. Walkling, you possibly remember a lot of families who settled here when the Strip opened and continued to make Perry their home for years and years, and the chances are you have outlived at least most of them. Could you tell us who some of these individuals are?
There was a family named Pressler, a man and wife and several girls and one boy. Their name was Pressler, and they tried to hold a lot right on the east side of the square. I think it was the second and third lots, and they tried to run a restaurant, and they disagreed amongst themselves who would manage it, and they didn't make a very good success of it. Later, one of the daughters went out east of town about 5 miles and got a claim that she could file on, and her mother and her moved on out on that claim later. She married a man named Hanson, Dick Hanson. He was a brother of John Hanson, who later became a banker here in Perry. Well, they lived on that claim for several years, but the old man drank a good deal, and the boy was a kind of a tough character. Well, they mortgaged the place, and the law came out there to make the move. And they put the old lady in the bottom of a wagon and put a mattress on top of her, and it took 2 or 3 to hold her down till they had the biggest fight out there. So
You knew Henry S. Johnson in the early day too, did you not, Mr. Walker?
a mule kicked me on broke my arm, and I was driving 4 little mules to a load of wood on the street there with one hand. And I saw a man standing on the sidewalk, and he came out there, and I stopped to trying to sell the wood. He came out there and talked to me a minute. I first thought he wanted to buy the wood, and it was, he told me his name. It was Henry S. Johnson, and he saw my arm broke, and he told me about some of his relatives that had broken their legs, and they didn't get it set just right. And he was afraid that I hadn't got my arm set right, and told me that I better have an old doctor there, Dr. Bringle, look at it. And that was the first meeting I ever had with Henry S. Johnson. He later became one of my best friends for many, many years.
Well, when did you become acquainted with a man here by the name of Mr. Little?
Mr. Little wasn't the first postmaster, but he soon became interested in the post office. He had lived before that in Guthrie, and I think he was in the law business. Anyhow, he knew quite a lot about law and so forth. And he was also quite a forestry man. He liked trees, and he knew the names of different kinds of trees as well as any man I ever knew. And he was postmaster and gave the best of satisfaction. Everybody liked him, but I better not tell the rest of it.
Your work for Mr. Walkering, all these years you have supported yourself. You have had good times, you've had bad times, but I understand that you have never allowed the government to give you any pension or any old age assistance. Is this right?
That is right. I'm an old man, and I have never accepted any charity that I know of. I have a daughter that is pretty well fixed, and I was in trouble in California. My wife was bedfast for 2 years and a half, and she sent $200 to me. Well, I sent it right back to her the next mail, and I never have it. I told to me. Well, I sent it right back to her the next mail, and I never have it. I told to me. Well, I sent it right back to her the next mail, and I never have it. I told to me. Well, I sent it right back to her the next mail, and I never have it. I told to me. Well, I sent it right back to her the next mail, and I never have it. I told to me. Well, I sent it right back to her the next mail, and I never have it. I told to me. Well, I sent it right back to her the next mail, and I never have it. I told to me. For 2 years and a half, and she sent $200 to me. Well, I sent it right back to her the next mail, and I never have it. I told some Perry men here when I left and knew that I was entirely broke. They talked to me, and asked me to sign a petition, I guess it was, for old age pension. I don't want to tell them I told them this.
For the last several years, and maybe all of your life, you have made ropes and lariats and things of that nature, and you are still doing that now to support yourself.
Oh, so leather. In my early life, my mother taught me a little about making rope by hand. It is very slow and difficult. And she also learned me to tan a good many hides, make moccasins and whips and a little leather craft, all by hand, or very slow and tedious. Well, later I was working with a surveying outfit, locating the Rock Island Railroad. It was the Choctaw Road at that time, and railroad. It was the Choctaw Road at that time, and I got a job from the surveyor, and we were sounding the South Canadian River, driving a pipe down through the sand to find how deep the solid rock was in the same places up and down the river for a bridge. And that bridge is the Rock Island Railroad Bridge today. Well, we would drive the pipe down from 25 to 50 feet before it would strike bottom. And we made a homemade pile driver. I can't describe it here, but it would raise a block of wood that would weigh about 600 pounds, 12 feet high, and drop on the end of the pipe to drive it. Well, we had a crane of a thing to pull that block up again, and held by a rope, and that rope had to slip around a wooden drum to fall. We'd slacken the rope and the block would fall. Well, it wore the rope out, slipping around that drum, and there wasn't any way that the engineer knew of how to get another rope. It was extra big. Well, the government at that time had sent a carload of rope there of twine to some Indians at McAllister. Well, the Indians didn't order that rope or that twine, and they didn't hardly know what it was for and had no use for it. Well, I told the foreman of this surveying outfit, his name was H.M. Schoff, S-H-O-F-F. If he'd get a lot of that twine, I thought I could make a rope. Well, he did. He got several hundred pounds of it in balls. Well, brought it out there, and I worked a couple of weeks, but I made a rope 90 feet long. It must have been nearly an inch and a half in diameter. Well, we used it for practically 5 months in drilling that well, driving that pipe up and down the river in different places. And when we were through, the rope was in fairly good condition yet. That's the first rope commercially or anything of that kind that I ever made. And since that, I've made many miles of rope. And I've improved my method many times until I got it so I have made 2,000 feet of half-inch rope in one day by myself with homemade machinery that I made from old lawnmower parts mostly. And I had pretty good market for 30-foot lariats twisted extra hard of the best material that I could get. Well, I still sell those lariats and whips that I have made according to the shape and rule that my mother learned me, making whips for actual drovers. They wasn't picture show guys or drugstore cowboys. They were to be used, Indian tanned oil leather, and I still have them by the dozen that I sell about as fast as I can make them. And if there's any person that hears this that would like to have a 6, 8, or a 12-foot bull whip, write me a note and I'll send you one.
I understand you made one of these lariats for President Johnson, and he in turn wrote you a letter. Would you tell us about this?
I'm no politician. I don't know anything about politics. In fact, I don't know much of anything but handwork. But I thought many people admired the lariat ropes I had made, and the cowboys and rodeo men that used them thought they were extra nice. So I thought I would send President Johnson one, just for fun. Well, I tried to make an extra-looking nice one. I put a brass hondo in place of a leather one in it, and I tied a rose knot on the end and coiled it up and took it to the post office, and the lady told me that I needn't to box it. I could send it that way, but it would be a good scheme for me to write a little letter and put a stamp on it, and they would fasten it to the whip. So I did. I wrote that I had made it myself and that I was 98 years old and that I had never attended school, but my wife had taught me what I knew, and I thought possibly he would like. I said, "You're a very busy man, and I don't want to take your time, and I know it's a great strain on you for the important questions that you have to answer, and I thought it would be good for you to rest your thoughts from the strain a few minutes, and I would tell you a little something about myself in this letter." And I did. I've got a copy of that letter out there in my suitcase. That's what I wrote to him.
He answered your letter then.
In a few days after I sent that to President Johnson, I received as nice a letter as I ever have in my life from him. And he complimented me of being as old as I am and still supporting myself by my hands.
Would you like to say that I would like to...
Came from California, especially to attend the 75th anniversary of the opening of the Cherokee Strip, in which I took a part. And I have a home in California and can only be away a few days. But I came especially for this celebration, and I'm hoping to have a good time. Is that it?
Tomorrow, Mr. Walkling, you will have the opportunity to meet many of your old friends. We're certainly happy to have you back in Perry. We hope that you can continue to come back for many more years. If you want to make it for the next